And Suresh is a food, drink, and travel writer, and he's been writing for 15 years. And his writing has been, appears actually, on a variety of radio, print, and online venues. And you are also currently the CBC Toronto food guide. So
That's
welcome,
correct,
Suresh.
yes. Thank you for having me.
So Suresh and I are going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Now, I wanted to start by connecting a little bit to the film that we just saw, because I heard you once say that you met Jonathan Gold at an interesting moment in your own life when you were in LA and you were still working in computers before you made the switch to food. And I wanted to ask you what that encounter meant to you and how his writing and his work has influenced you.
Yeah, so a little bit of backstory. So my first career as an adult was in information technology, in IT. So growing up, my mom was always the food influence in my life, and my grandma, and my dad was always the tech computer influence. And growing up in Sri Lanka and Colombo, we were growing up in the middle of a civil war, on and off for many, many years, for 30 years. But I remember when I was a kid, 8 or 9 years old, school would be out for months at a time because a bomb went off, at a school nearby, and they would shut down a number of grade schools. So during that time, my mom thought that it would be best that I would go to my dad's training school, because my dad had a computer training school. It was a very popular place. So as I was this 8, 9-year-old kid sitting in front of a computer and kind of figuring my way around. But things clicked. I mean, computers became it was just so intuitive for me. I felt like I understood this piece of hardware really, really well at a very young age. So we moved to Canada in the late 80s, early 90s. And after high school, my dad was pushing me to go into computers because I just had a natural knack for it. And he opened a training school in Toronto. So when I was about 14 years old, I got certified in the Microsoft certification program. And I was the youngest certified person in the country. So when I was 15, 16, when I wasn't in school, I'd be teaching at my dad's office. Like literally teaching to 20, 30 people about how to get certified, how to take a computer apart and put it back together. And it was interesting. I found it really interesting because I'm teaching at 15, 16. It was a weird thing. And that was my introduction to Mississauga. So after high school, I was offered a chance to go to university, but I really felt like it would have slowed me down. I had this ego about just being ahead of the curve. And my mom's, food influence was somewhere in the background. Understanding how chickens end up from animals to how they're on the plate. How an eggplant goes from this beautiful piece of vegetable to this charred dish on the plate. So I kind of had that in the background, but it was never really a part of my life. And then I got into IT, naturally, because my dad pushed me into it. I dropped out of school, got into IT, and I worked my way up really, really quickly, to the point where I was working for a large IT company and I was traveling the world. And this one particular assignment, so this is a long answer, sorry. This one particular assignment, I found myself in California, in Pasadena, in Los Angeles, and I was there for an assignment for a month. And my goal was to go into this high school and then redesign their email system. So this was during the summer months. School was out. It was August 2004-05. By this point, I already had started a blog to document my food journals here and there because I was traveling around the world for this job and I was taking photos of food. So I had this site going on in the background. I was reading about food more and more. I was in IT. I was at this crossroads where I was hating IT as every day passed. Because at that point in my life, I was bored of computers. There was nothing challenging about these problems in front of me. In hindsight, if I had gone into developing and writing code and building something, I would have been way happier. But my dad and I pushed myself into troubleshooting, fixing the problems that other people create. So I was at a crossroads where I was in Pasadena for a month by myself. I would go to the school every morning, do maybe 90 minutes of work, and then I'd have the rest of the day to do whatever I wanted. But I was alone, and really felt alone. So I had this apartment, I had a car, and I learned about the Pacific Coast Highway. I learned about how similar LA looked to Mississauga and to Toronto and to Scarborough. And I was trying to figure out, at this point, the light bulb went off in my head when I was like, okay, I gotta leave IT. This is terrible. Like, I'm like in my early 20s, I really hate this job. It pays really, really well. I'm at the top of my game, but I want to go into food writing. That's my passion, because my mom's influence now was coming back really hard. So I took my colleague out for lunch one day, and he wanted to show me a part of San Gabriel Valley, where Pasadena is, that's known for food trucks. So just to kind of put you into context, this is before the food truck movement in Ontario, before the food truck movement in LA. This was just like before all the chefs quit their restaurants and opened really, really cool trucks. This was just, like food trucks that were serving neighborhoods. It was just serving people food. So I went to the street, and there were a number of food trucks there. And we were just eating food. And I was telling my colleague, who is not in food, what I wanted to do with my life. Because he noticed that I was really interested about this taco that I had in my hand. And he said, you should go and talk to that gentleman over there. He's a food writer in LA. And at this time, I did not know who Jonathan Goh was. This is really kind of pre-internet, pre-social media days, not pre-internet days. So I walked over, and he was eating, I think it was a shrimp or octopus taco. And I said, hey, I'm a food writer from Toronto. Here's kind of what I do. I grew up in Scarborough, so I'm more comfortable in the burbs. I don't really write about French restaurants and Italian restaurants. I write about the small places that I grew up eating from high school. But do you have any advice in finding these places and navigating the storytelling? How do you approach it? Because I don't want to review places. And I could tell right away that he wanted nothing to do with me. He was just busy having his lunch, and I was a kid with a camera. But his advice was essentially, he distilled into 2 words. He said, just drive. Just drive and explore your neighbors. And this kind of really just stuck in my head. This idea of the tactile, manual, analog way of doing things. There's essentially what he passed on was that he was trying to imply that there's no shortcut. And that's kind of, that my career was built on the idea of there's no shortcut, and it's just drive.
Yeah, you've really taken that to heart, because you do food tours, and you do food tours also in Mississauga, although you're more Toronto-based. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the strengths of the food landscape here in Mississauga?
The beauty of the food landscape in the GTA as a whole is that there are things you can identify about certain pockets of it. So you can't generalize and say Mississauga is known for something. You can't. You could have 40 years ago. You could have 50 years ago. But the beauty is that there are these pockets, right? So you have this mosaic or jigsaw puzzle, whatever you want to call it. But the second part of that is that it changes. The makeup changes literally now. I'm not a historian, but anecdotally, it feels like it changes every 5 to 10 years. Because the beauty of this country is that we have these waves of immigration, and people land where they land, and they live in the pockets they live in. But when they become successful, and when they have kids, and when they become successful enough to, upgrade their house or move to a better place, they pick up and then go somewhere else, which then leaves that address open to another wave. So the beauty of Mississauga is that, for me, it's changed a lot since I was introduced to it through my dad, because he had an office at Dundas in Ontario, and that was where I learned about the food there. So back then, to me, when in my 20s, 20 years ago-ish, it was very, very West Indian. There was still lots of Eastern European and Portuguese and Italian. And now, the coolest thing for me now is, same with Scarborough and same with Toronto, the newcomers from Syria and Lebanon and Jordan are influencing the scene, but also the Sri Lankans that used to be in Scarborough are moving to Mississauga, which is, again, it's crazy. It changes every decade.
So how does it then compare to Scarborough and Toronto?
So if you apply those same rules to Toronto, the thing with Toronto is, well, let's come to Toronto third. Let's do Scarborough first. So Scarborough in the 60s and 70s, Eastern European, Hungarian, Greek, Italian, Portuguese for sure. Then late 70s to 80s after the Trudeau Act, Vietnamese, Chinese, Filipino, Sri Lankan. Vietnamese, Chinese, Filipino, Sri Lankan. Over and over. Some Portuguese. And then after the 2000s, Middle Easterners. So shawarma row. So you have the Lebanese, you have the Iraqi, you have the Palestinians, lots of Syrians. So Scarborough now is more Middle Eastern than it was 5 years ago. And the Sri Lankans and the Greeks have moved out. So like I would say, I mean, a lot of people say Sri Lankan food's best in Scarborough. Kind of, but there's better Sri Lankan food in Stouffville and Brampton and Mississauga because they keep moving out. Stouffville is like the whitest town, I would say, but not really. There's great Sri Lankan food in Stouffville. So now in Toronto is you just multiply that, you compound that in terms of speed, because you have a city, it's a cosmopolitan city, it operates at a much faster pace, and the rules are determined by social media and by rent and by just trends, right? So fashion, rent, and social media dictates how quickly that flips.
You were talking about the changes, and I wonder, how does the food landscape in Mississauga reflect the challenges of this place?
It's a good question. So the thing about Mississauga is that it's a sprawling city, and I thought Scarborough was a sprawl, but Scarborough is actually more connected than Mississauga. Transit rules can apply because transit is different, but also just Mississauga just feels like a much more spread out city. Right? It's also bigger than Scarborough in terms of population too, by 200,000. You guys are coming up to almost 1 million, I think. So the sprawl, essentially for me, what that means is the neighborhoods are not going to be as obvious to find. So the cool thing at Toronto is there is a little India. There are 4 Chinatowns. There is a little Persia, right? So there is one street that is identifiable as Toronto. So you saw Torangelis in the movie. We have a Toronto. In Scarborough, same kind of rules apply, somewhat harder to find. But in Mississauga, because it's a younger city and because it's way more sprawled out, there really isn't, there is a Chinatown, sure, but there really isn't like a little India just yet. Right. But you can kind of see the seeds right now, which I think is really cool.
I guess I also wonder, like I see, correct me if I'm wrong, but I see this sort of trend emerging where people are coming into Mississauga and Scarborough to eat now from Toronto. And I wonder, what do you attribute that to? Because there seems to be within the last 2 years, I see a total change in how people in Toronto talk about food in Mississauga.
I don't know how to answer that. I guess, I mean, like, so...
I mean, you have a part to play.
That's very sweet of you to say. Yeah, so maybe the CBC content. So maybe it encourages people to go outside of the downtown core and explore cities. But I mean, also social media connects us too, right? So I like to think that if you're a food interested person and you're on Instagram and you see someone post a photo of like a noodle soup in Mississauga and it's tagged, I like to think that you would be curious enough to click it, see where it's geographically located, and then maybe you go there right away because you're that kind of person, or you bookmark it because you're that kind of person, or it's now in the recesses of your mind, right? Mm-hmm. But there is definitely way more attention from people that live in Toronto going to Mississauga, to Scarborough, Richmond Hill, etc. I know that just based on the sheer number of requests I get via Twitter or email. So that's a good thing. I think we could do better in terms of having more media, but I do think that it's a start.
I guess I also wonder, if you were to give it a global perspective, how does Mississauga fit into sort of the global perspective of food?
I know a lot of people say that the GTA and Mississauga and Toronto are very, very multicultural and you can eat the world here. I travel quite a bit. When I travel, again, like the rules that I apply is when I travel somewhere, I eat the way I would eat here. So I eat from a list, but then I know that lists are not good. And then I will walk around and explore and eat at places that come across my feed or come across my vision. I cannot enforce this enough, and I'm not being hyperbolic. We really are spoiled living in Mississauga and Toronto and the GTA, because you and I can say after the show, what do you feel like eating? And you can say sushi, and we can probably find the best sushi, within 20 minutes. You can flip that and say you want laksa, like Malaysian food. You can flip that and say you want this really particular type of ramen. And we can find that really well. Whereas when we travel, you're often limited by the regional cuisine of that country, which plays a much bigger role in the culture of that country, right? Which is also great, because I mean, you go to Italy, you have really incredible regional Italian food in some parts, but that's all that there is, right? Whereas here, immigration has given us this wonderful gift where it's given us a perspective into a very specific culture of that person's food, and we have a really good version of that in most cases here.
So then how do you pick through this landscape? Like, how do you pick the places that you highlight in Mississauga? Do you also, I mean, I was making sort of the comment that you seem a little bit like the Jonathan Gold driving around. So when you do that, are you also like Jonathan Gold? You do repeatedly eat at the same place, make sure it's solid. How do you choose?
So the answer is it's very manual. It's very analog. So I try. I would never call myself a food critic or a restaurant critic, but I do everything they do for what I need for my job. So I approach it like a critic, but I'm not a critic because I'm not rating and there's no stars, and I'm not. If I didn't have a good meal at some place, I would just skip writing about that place. The real estate is very important to me in terms of what I can write. So a typical week would be, I'd see which days I have open. If a Thursday is open, I would try to get 2 or 3 of my friends together. 4 is an ideal number, 4 in one car. We would pick one.
Why is 4 an ideal number?
Because of the amount of food that you can order and the number of places that you can visit before the food coma sets in, right?
Makes sense.
It's a lot harder when it's one person. It's a lot harder when it's 2 people.
Yeah.
3 is, I would say maybe 3 is the magic number, but 4 is amazing. More stomachs. So we would get into a car. By this time, there's been an email thread, and we figure out what neighborhood we want to visit. So we could start with one neighborhood. It's not just Mississauga. It's got to be like, the northern quadrant or near the airport, or like, I don't know, south, or like maybe like we'll do Burnhamthorpe. We'll do Ordundas. So one neighborhood, one street, and then it's literally like we drive. We have some sort of a preliminary list, and then we're literally just doing this. We're literally zigzagging back and forth. 70% places we've already been to, 30% new. And then we just add on to it. So it's like a layer cake. So I'll do that a number of times before that one place jumps out that is interesting. And then, I believe that no restaurant does everything well. There's no restaurant on the planet where everything on the menu is great. So I need to find that 1 or 2 dishes that are great, because that's where the story is. There's a lot of fluff that you have to dig through, right?
I guess I wonder, when you're eating this much, you must know what the emerging food trends are. So can you tell us what some of the changes are? We saw the sort of, you mentioned food trucks being a trend at one point and so on, and pop-ups. What do you see right now as emerging food trends, generally speaking, and particularly for Mississauga?
Mississauga is what I noticed, the Sri Lankan thing is actually big, the Sri Lankan thing. It's kind of fascinating. It's like, I'll do my food tours through Mississauga, we'll go eat on the streets that we normally eat in, and then you turn around and you're like, whoa, that's a new Sri Lankan place. Sri Lankans aren't really coming to Canada right now. Things have kind of settled down back home, and if anything, Sri Lankans are going back home. And then you go into the place and you talk to the owner and you find out, oh, she used to live in Scarborough, and now she lives in Mississauga because her kids went to school here. So the Sri Lankan thing is noticeable. You can feel it in various pockets. And then for me, the story of Mississauga right now is, there are 3 parts to it. It's North African, so like Moroccan, the Middle Eastern, which is kind of everywhere, but I see it here too. So I'll see Yemeni places open up. I'll see the modern Israeli place, the Egyptian place. Those are all in the last 2-3 years, and it's still going. And then the third thing that I would say that I notice about Mississauga is that the Asian kick is, we went through such a Southeast Asian dessert and regional kick in Toronto. So lots of bubble tea 2.0. Our bubble tea was hot 15 years ago. Now it's super hot again, and that's spilling over into Mississauga. So like the sweet stuff of Southeast Asian food.
Yeah, I also once heard you mention a little bit about how people are eating is also changing, or where they're eating, and you mentioned parking lots, I remember. Could you elaborate a little bit on this idea of now meeting people in parking lots to buy food from them?
Oh, okay. Yeah, the pop-ups. Okay. So the
That's
interesting.
certainly a new trend.
Yeah. It is.
Yeah.
It's a new thing. For sure, it's a new thing. The problem with our food system in the GTA and kind of all over Toronto, kind of all over in the US too, I guess, is that rent is really high. So the barrier to enter the business is really high now. It used to be 10 years ago that if you were a newcomer, banks don't easily give you loans, but it used to be that you could probably get a family loan from someone and you could probably open a small, modest place, like a parking spot-sized place, and serve shawarma or something. It's really hard to do that now. Mississauga, it's easier than Toronto. Scarborough is easier than Toronto. But the rent has skyrocketed everywhere in the last couple of years, and the taxes have skyrocketed. So what I'm seeing now is I'm seeing a lot of newcomers in the last 3 years. So we're really narrowing this down. Within the last 3 years, newcomers are coming to the GTA. They're struggling to find rental spaces. They're struggling to get loans. They're resorting to Facebook, to social media, and they're selling food through Facebook, through Marketplace. And this is really kind of also two intersections where Marketplace has really blown up in the last year, where everyone is using Marketplace more than Kijiji, because at least with Marketplace, you know who you're meeting and you don't have to worry about that sketchy person that's going to meet you in a parking lot and if they're going to rob you when you're buying something. Facebook has the identity, right? So I'm seeing a lot of food vendors jumping on that train. So you would open Marketplace, you can type in a type of food. You can say Indonesian food. There's an amazing Indonesian vendor in Mississauga that does food on Facebook. And then when you type that, all of a sudden, I feel like when you open Marketplace, you'll see like tables and chairs, computers and coffee makers. But as soon as you filter, the landscape changes completely. And it's almost like you enter a completely different arena. So you see all these vendors that are, very illegally, not illegally, but they're operating in the gray zone, where the gray zone meaning that, in the GTA, is anyone from public health here? I just have to ask because this has happened before, so nobody, okay. So in the GTA, if you want to sell food in Toronto, or the GTA, you have to have a food made from a licensed facility, right? And you have to have an operator's certificate, handler certificate, etc. Obviously, yes, yeah, food should be carefully prepared. But these vendors are not necessarily doing that. They're making food the way they would make it at home for their kids. Now, I don't have a problem with it, but I would like them to end up in a kitchen, obviously, because you don't want someone to get sick. But my approach is that, well, this is how my mom makes the food, and when you meet these people and you build that rapport, you can determine for yourself whether what you're eating is going to be okay or not. I'm okay with the risks. My wife probably not, my mom probably not, but I'm kind of okay with it. But this is happening more and more and more to the point where I feel like this bubble is going to explode any minute. Because public health is going to come knocking, people will be reprimanded and all that stuff. So my goal is to try to see if I can encourage them after I eat their food to say, hey, Aisha, this is great, but can you rent a kitchen and do it through that kitchen? And I can show you where the kitchen is? Because there are commissary kitchens everywhere. $25 an hour, you can do that. And I would hope that they would then go to the commissary kitchen every Saturday or something, make the food there, put it on Facebook, and tell people from Facebook to meet them there. So that's my goal.
I guess that's the note to open it up. So, are there any questions in the audience that you would like to ask? If you do, please put up your hand and a microphone will come to you. For people selling food? Yeah, Instagram, Kijiji, Craigslist, but nothing as crazy as Facebook. WhatsApp is also pretty big. So in my neighborhood, East Toronto, there's a guy on WhatsApp who sells incredible sourdough bread. And he has a wood-fired oven in his backyard. So he has this WhatsApp group that he slowly kind of collects. So it's very niche, and he can control it in that sense, right? The chances of a public health inspector finding him pretty narrow. So he'll basically say on a Friday,
I have 4 loaves, I have sunflower seed, sourdough, and then people will say, I want one, and then he'll arrange a time for the people to pick up. In Asia, WhatsApp is huge for food. In the US, WhatsApp is huge for food. Because at least that, in that sense, you can control it. And it's kind of through word of mouth that you find out.
I just have a question about the top 10 whatever in Toronto. You see this not against your blog TO or others, but if they're paid advertisements to say the top 10 burritos, the top 10 poke bowls, what is just marketing versus real authentic reviews? How does the consumer really know if it's just advertising versus real?
If you want me to be honest, it's all some sort of marketing. I wouldn't say it's all advertising, but it's all some sort of marketing. It's not because people want to dupe you. It's just because media doesn't pay in Toronto or anywhere in Canada at this point. I mean, like if you look at the U.S., there is really a movement towards having a clear voice and a process in building lists, if lists are a thing for the outlet. Where in Toronto, every list that you see has been written by someone that's behind a computer that has Googled places, and they've sort of constructed something that is designed to grab your view. I'm totally not exaggerating. I've seen them in action. And like you can usually tell when the images are from Instagram, so they're pulling in images because they haven't taken their own photos. In many of the cases, the writers haven't even visited those places. But lists are kind of useful. I mean, if you were traveling to Toronto, that's the first place that you would land on, right? Like if you visited Toronto and you wanted to know who had the best burger, you would probably type best burger Google in Google in Toronto, right? And you would probably land on that list. So I'd like to think that list will give you some sort of direction. But it's not useful. It's certainly not useful for me. It is certainly 99% marketing.
Now, I wanted to ask you before we wrap up. Sorry, did you have a question? No? Now, if we all are very hungry after seeing the film and hearing you speak, and we want to eat somewhere around here, what are your top 2-3 places you recommend?
Well, Mississauga is pretty incredible. So you could do a couple of different things. You could drive on Confederation Parkway. You could pick any street, whether it's Dundas or Ontario, pick a street and you would land on at some amazing places. But off the top of my head, I'd say I'm a fan of the pastries at Lazar Bakery, which is down the street. Breakfasting, I think, is pretty special.
Is it breakfast? Because right now it's 8 o'clock.
Breakfasting is emblematic of the way Southeast Asians name their restaurants. Oh. So it is partially for breakfast, but then they also do amazing lunch items as well. And it's also spelled breakfast, I-N-G. So literally like verbalizing it. So it's located down the street, just further, I guess, west on Burnham Thorpe. Incredible specific Malaysian dishes there. So they have roti canai, where you could have like this stringy roti with a chicken curry. They can have bak kut teh, which is like this pork bone soup type of dish. Next to it, in that plaza, there's a Chinese Hakka place. Across the street from this place is Chinatown, like the Chinatown building, and Lion City is great in Chinatown. Lion City is another Singaporean restaurant. If you want South Indian food, my mom loves Guru Lakshmi. Mm-hmm. I think Guru Lakshmi, everyone knows Guru Lakshmi. Why am I sending you there? Don't go to Guru Lakshmi. They already have lots of people. But there's another place called Anna Lakshmi, which is kind of at the border of Brampton, Mississauga. That's great. One more, Rick's Good Eats. Rick's is great. He's at the border of Mississauga and Brampton. And here's a guy where there's a really interesting duality between the way his mom used to cook and the way he cooks. And it's not fusion, but it's this kind of perspective on preserving your parents' food, but also trying something new and being influenced by your surroundings. Yeah, so that's a good list, I think.
Great, thank you so much for that list, Suresh.
Thank you.
Now, before I let you go, I want to remind you that you will receive, through Eventbrite, a feedback form for today's events. And if you could please fill it out, we'd love to hear what your experience was like. So please now join me in thanking Suresh for his time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.